February 12, 1945, the sky over Berlin is a gray sheet of ice and smoke. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler pulls his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a steep climb, throttle wide open, engine screaming. Below him, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses drones eastward like iron birds, their contrails scratching white lines across the frozen heavens. He has done this 100 times. Close fast. Pick a straggler. Aim for the cockpit or an engine. Fire. Break away. But today, something is different. At 800 meters, still out of effective range, the air around him erupts. Not flak, not tracer rounds, something else. Invisible fingers of steel tear through his right wing, his canopy spiderwebs. The cockpit fills with the smell of burnt metal and fear. He banks hard, diving away, heart hammering, blood cold. He never got close enough to fire. They hit him first. From a distance he thought was safe, and they didn't miss. By the winter of 1945, the air war over Europe had become a grinding nightmare of attrition. For nearly 3 years, the United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine of daylight strategic bombing, sending waves of heavy bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany to destroy factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and cities. It was a philosophy born from faith in precision, firepower, and the belief that air power alone could break the enemy's will. But it came at a horrifying cost. In the early years, before long-range fighter escorts arrived, American bomber crews flew into a gauntlet of death. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with years of combat experience, tore through the formations with brutal efficiency. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s were fast, maneuverable, and flown by men who understood that survival depended on aggression. They closed to point-blank range, sometimes within 50 meters, hammering the bombers with cannon fire until wings buckled and fuselages exploded. The losses were staggering. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. Nearly 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. It became known as Black Thursday, a day that nearly ended the American daylight bombing campaign altogether. Crews lived in a state of constant gnawing dread. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman in 1943 was measured in missions, not months. Many never completed their required 25. They died in fire, in freezing air at 30,000 feet, or tumbled to earth in burning wreckage over enemy territory. The odds were not in their favor, and everyone knew it. Then came the fighters. By early 1944, the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt arrived in numbers large enough to matter. These long-range escorts could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, engaging German fighters before they could rip into the formations. The balance began to shift. Luftwaffe losses mounted. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. Green pilots, some with fewer than 30 hours in type, were thrown into combat and slaughtered. But even with air superiority swinging toward the Allies, the threat remained. A determined German pilot, closing fast with cannons blazing, could still bring down a bomber. And they did, every single day. The defensive firepower of a B-17 or B-24 was formidable on paper. Each bomber bristled with 50 caliber machine guns in turrets, waist positions, nose, and tail. A tight formation could put up a curtain of lead. But there was a problem. Hitting a fast-moving fighter with a manually aimed machine gun while flying in formation at high altitude in freezing wind was almost impossible. Gunners fired thousands of rounds for every kill. Most missed, and the German pilots knew it. They exploited blind spots, attacked from angles where return fire was weakest, and pressed in close where the bombers couldn't bring enough guns to bear. Something had to change. That change had been in development since 1940, hidden behind layers of secrecy deeper than almost any other weapon of the war. It was called the VT fuse, short for variable time, though some called it the proximity fuse. It was a technological marvel, a miniature radio transmitter and receiver packed into the nose of an artillery shell or an aircraft round designed to detonate automatically when it passed near a target. No direct hit required. The shell simply needed to get close. The fuse would sense the presence of metal, calculate distance using reflected radio waves, and trigger the explosion at the optimal moment to maximize shrapnel spread. It turned near misses into kills. For the first time in history, you didn't have to actually hit the target to destroy it. The concept was revolutionary, but building it was a nightmare. The fuse had to withstand the immense G-forces of being fired from a gun or cannon, operate reliably at extreme altitudes and temperatures, and cost little enough to mass produce. It required vacuum tubes so small and durable that they redefined what was possible in electronics. The work was done in secret labs across the United States, coordinated by the National Defense Research Committee, and treated with the same level of classification as the atomic bomb. The fear was simple. If the Germans captured an intact fuse and reverse-engineered it, they could deploy the same technology against Allied bombers. The advantage would evaporate overnight. Worse, they could use it to devastate London with V-1 buzz bombs fitted with proximity fuses, turning every near miss into a lethal blast. So the fuses were used sparingly at first, only over water where a dud would sink, and never over enemy-held land. The U.S. Navy deployed them first in the Pacific in 1943 using VT-fused anti-aircraft shells to shred Japanese kamikaze attacks. The results were stunning. Hit rates skyrocketed. Entire waves of attacking planes were obliterated before they could close on the fleet. But in Europe, the weapon remained largely secret until late 1944 when a decision was made. The war was nearing its end. The Luftwaffe was crippled but still dangerous. Allied air superiority was slipping toward total dominance, but bomber losses continued. The risk of deploying the proximity fuse over Germany was weighed against the lives it could save. The decision came down from the top. Use it. Equip the bombers. By January 1945, select B-17 and B-24 formations began loading their defensive turrets with VT-fused ammunition. The gunners were briefed in whispers, told not to discuss it, not to write home about it. They were given strict orders. If they had to bail out over enemy territory, they were to say nothing about the ammunition. Nothing. The fuses themselves were designed to self-destruct on impact, reducing the chance of recovery. But even a fragmentary shell casing could give the enemy clues. The secret had to be protected at all costs. For the German fighter pilots climbing into their cockpits each morning, unaware of what was waiting for them in the sky, the world was about to become far more terrifying than they ever imagined. For a German fighter pilot, in early 1945, every mission was a gamble with death. Fuel was rationed, spare parts were scarce, the airfields were bombed relentlessly. Many pilots flew with injuries that would have grounded them a year earlier. They climbed into cockpits knowing the odds were worse than ever, but they still believed in their skill, their aircraft, and their ability to survive by sheer aggression and experience. That belief shattered the first time they encountered the proximity fuse. There was no warning, no intelligence briefing, no tactical adjustment that could prepare them. One moment, a pilot would be lining up a shot on a bomber, closing the distance, finger on the trigger. The next, the air around him would explode, not ahead, not behind, right there, in the space he occupied. Shrapnel would shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, or rip through the cockpit itself. Some pilots died instantly. Others fought crippled aircraft back to base, limbs torn, bleeding, eyes wide with confusion and terror. They described it as invisible fire, shells that hunted them, bullets that knew where they were. It didn't make sense. They were experienced men, aces some of them, who had survived years of combat. But this was something beyond tactics, beyond courage. It was like fighting a curse. The science behind it was elegant in its brutality. The proximity fuse functioned on a simple principle. A tiny radio transmitter in the nose of the shell emitted a continuous signal. When that signal bounced off a metallic object, a receiver measured the frequency shift caused by the relative motion. This was the Doppler effect, the same reason a train whistle changes pitch as it passes. When the reflected signal indicated the shell was within lethal range, usually 20 to 30 feet, a firing circuit triggered the detonator. The explosion sent a cloud of steel fragments expanding outward at thousands of feet per second. It didn't matter if the shell was aimed perfectly. As long as it passed near the target, the fuse did the rest. The fragmentation pattern was wide enough to damage aircraft at ranges where a direct hit would have been statistically impossible. For bomber gunners, this was a godsend. They no longer had to lead the target perfectly or account for every variable of wind, speed, and altitude. They just had to get the rounds close. And at the volumes of fire a B-17 could produce, that was almost guaranteed. The secrecy surrounding the weapon was absolute. Even among Allied forces, only a select few understood how it worked. The fuses were manufactured in facilities under armed guard. Engineers signed non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties of imprisonment. Shipments were tracked with the same rigor as gold bullion. The fear of a single fuse falling into enemy hands bordered on paranoia, but it was justified. German engineers were among the best in the world. If they captured even a damaged unit and pieced together its function, they could replicate the technology in months. The Allies knew this because they themselves had studied captured German innovations and turned them into weapons. The jet engine, the infrared scope, guided missiles. The war had become a race not just of armies but of laboratories. Whoever innovated faster and kept their secrets longer gained the edge. The proximity fuse was America's ace, and it had to remain hidden until it no longer mattered. By the time the Germans understood what they were facing, it would be too late to respond. For the bomber gunners, the introduction of VT-fused ammunition changed everything. Most had spent months firing at tiny, fast-moving specks in the sky, watching their tracer rounds arc wide or fall short, feeling helpless as German fighters ripped through their formation. Now they had a weapon that actually worked. The psychological impact was profound. Confidence replaced dread. Gunners who once fired conservatively, trying to preserve ammunition, now opened up earlier and more aggressively. They didn't need to see the hits. The explosions in midair told them everything. Fighters began breaking off attacks at greater distances. The Germans grew cautious, wary, and that hesitation was fatal in air combat. A pilot who hesitates is a pilot who dies. The bomber formations became fortresses in truth, not just in name. The VT rounds turned the sky around each aircraft into a sphere of invisible lethality. Any fighter entering that sphere risked annihilation. The tactical balance, already tilting toward the Allies, became a rout. The Germans tried to adapt. Intelligence officers interrogated captured bomber crews, desperate for clues. Pilots reported the strange explosions, the impossible accuracy, the way shells seemed to detonate on their own. At first, Luftwaffe command dismissed it as exaggeration, battle fatigue, or the fog of war. Shells don't explode by themselves. It must be flak, or fighters firing from unseen angles. But the reports kept coming. Too many pilots, too many incidents, too much consistency. Something was happening, something new. Desperate to understand, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics. Pilots were ordered to attack from longer ranges, using 30mm cannons and unguided rockets launched from outside the effective envelope of defensive fire. But these weapons were less accurate. The kill rates dropped. Some pilots tried diving attacks from directly above, exploiting the blind spot in the bomber's dorsal turret coverage. But escort fighters pounced on anyone attempting such maneuvers. Others tried head-on attacks, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing a burst and then diving through the formation. It was suicidal. Many never pulled out. Those who did often flew straight into the stream of VT-fused fire from the oncoming bombers. The explosions swatted them from the sky like insects. The industrial miracle behind the proximity fuse was as impressive as the science. By 1945, American factories were producing over 100,000 VT fuses per week. Each one contained components that would have been considered cutting-edge laboratory equipment just 5 years earlier. Miniature vacuum tubes no larger than a pencil eraser. Battery cells capable of delivering power reliably at 40 below zero. Circuitry designed to survive rotational forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. All of this had to be assembled by workers, many F-towns. F them women, in factories that operated around the clock. The cost per unit was kept low enough to make them expendable. They were fired by the tens of thousands, and it didn't matter if some failed. Enough work to change the war. This was American industrial power at its peak. The ability to turn an idea from a physics lab into a mass-produced weapon in less than 3 years, and deploy it in numbers so overwhelming that the enemy couldn't counter it even if they understood it. The proximity fuse was proof that the Allies had already won the war of production, and by extension, the war itself. February 1945 marked the final crescendo of the air war over Germany. Berlin, once thought untouchable, was being bombed daily. The 8th and 15th Air Forces sent armadas of 1,000 bombers or more, escorted by hundreds of fighters, into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, but the force that climbed into the sky was a shadow of what it had been. Fuel shortages meant many aircraft sat grounded. The pilots who did fly were often boys 17 or 18 years old with minimal training and no combat experience. They flew into a storm of steel and fire, and most never returned. But among them were still the veterans, the survivors, the men who had fought since Poland or France and somehow lived. These men knew the sky, knew the bombers, knew how to kill, and they were the ones who first realized something had changed. Oberstleutnant Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated pilots and a general in charge of fighter operations, received reports from the front that made no tactical sense. Experienced pilots were being shot down before closing to firing range. Aircraft were exploding in midair with no visible hits. Fighters attacking from angles that should have been safe were disintegrating in bursts of shrapnel. Galland ordered investigations. Wreckage was examined. Pilots were debriefed. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had deployed a new weapon, something that detonated automatically, something the Germans had no counter for. On February 20th, during a raid on Nuremberg, the terror reached its peak. A gruppy of FW-190s, led by Major Gunther Rahl, one of the highest-scoring aces still alive, attempted a mass-coordinated attack on a formation of B-17s. The plan was textbook. Approach from head-on at high speed, fire a single devastating burst into the lead bomber, then break away beneath the formation before the gunners could react. Rahl had done this dozens of times. He knew it worked. He led his pilots in, throttles wide open, closing at over 600 miles per hour. At 1,000 meters, the gunners opened fire. Rahl expected the usual stream of tracers, easy to dodge, mostly ineffective. Instead, the air ahead of him turned into a wall of explosions. Not flak, not random, precise, deadly. His wingman's aircraft came apart, simply disintegrated in a cloud of flame and metal. Another FW-190 to his left rolled inverted and fell, trailing smoke, the pilot dead or unconscious. Rahl fired his cannon, saw his rounds impact the lead bomber's nose, and then banked hard, diving away as fast as his aircraft could go. He felt the shockwaves of explosions chasing him, shrapnel pinging off his fuselage. He made it out, barely. Of the 12 fighters that went in, only 5 came back. They never even got close enough to do real damage. The mission was a disaster. That night, Rahl wrote in his diary that they were fighting ghosts. Shells that knew where you were. Shells that could see. The psychological collapse came swiftly. Luftwaffe pilots, already demoralized by fuel shortages, inferior aircraft, and overwhelming numbers, now faced an invisible weapon that turned skill and experience into meaningless abstractions. Veterans who had survived years of war began refusing missions, not out of cowardice, but out of cold, rational calculation. There was no way to fight what they couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't counter. Younger pilots, witnessing their instructors and heroes die in flames, broke down in ready rooms. Some never climbed into their cockpits again. Suicide rates among Luftwaffe pilots in the final months of the war rose sharply. Many chose to die on their own terms rather than face the invisible fire in the sky. The command structure tried to hold the line. Orders were issued, discipline was enforced, pilots who refused to fly were court-martialed, some were executed as examples, but you can't shoot your way to victory when the enemy has a weapon you can't comprehend. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force, once the pride of the Third Reich, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting organization by March 1945. The bombers flew unopposed. The final realization came too late to matter. In early April, as the Reich crumbled under the weight of Soviet and Western Allied advances, German intelligence officers finally pieced together the nature of the weapon. Fragments of shells, recovered from crashed aircraft and analyzed in laboratories, revealed the presence of miniature radio components. Engineers examined the circuitry, tested the materials, and understood the principle. It was a proximity fuse, radio-activated, detonating on approach. They had suspected such a device was theoretically possible, but the engineering required to make it small, durable, and mass-producible was beyond what they believed the Americans capable of. They were wrong. The realization was bitter. By the time they understood the weapon, Germany had no industrial capacity to replicate it, no time to develop countermeasures, and no pilots left to train on new tactics. The war was over in all but name. The proximity fuse, in the end, was less a single decisive weapon and more the final symbol of why Germany lost. It represented the gap in industrial might, scientific organization, and resource allocation between the Allies and the Axis. Germany had brilliant scientists, talented engineers, and brave soldiers, but they couldn't outproduce, out-innovate, or outlast an enemy that turned entire economies into war machines. The impact on specific engagements was measurable. Allied bomber losses over Germany dropped sharply in the first quarter of 1945. Where a raid might have cost 30 or 40 aircraft in 1943, it now cost 5 or 10. The difference was the proximity fuse. Luftwaffe fighter losses, conversely, spiked. Pilots who once had a reasonable chance of survival found themselves flying into a slaughter. The statistics were damning. In January 1945, the Luftwaffe lost over 400 fighters in combat. In February, over 500. In March, over 600. Most were shot down by American fighters, but a significant and growing percentage fell to defensive fire from the bombers themselves. Gunners who once felt helpless now racked up kill after kill. Some bombers returned to base with crews claiming multiple confirmed kills, their guns still hot, the smell of cordite thick in the fuselage. The testimony of captured German pilots interrogated by Allied intelligence after the war painted a grim picture. Many described the final months as a slow, grinding nightmare. They flew knowing they would die, not fearing it, knowing it. The proximity fuse was mentioned again and again in these interviews. It was the thing they couldn't explain, couldn't escape, couldn't forget. One pilot, Lieutenant Heinrich Erler, shot down in late March and captured by American forces, described his last mission in vivid, haunted detail. He had been flying since 1940. He had over 200 combat missions. He was an ace. And on that final flight, attacking a formation of B-24 Liberators over Dresden, he watched his entire staffel annihilated in less than 2 minutes. The bombers didn't even change formation. They just kept flying, their guns tracking, and one by one his comrades exploded in midair. He saw one aircraft lose its wing to an explosion that occurred 10 meters away from any visible round. He saw another pilot bail out, his parachute shredded by shrapnel before it fully opened. Erler himself was hit by fragments from a proximity burst that detonated near his tail. His rudder controls failed. He nursed the crippled Bf-109 as far as he could before the engine quit and he crash-landed in a field. When the Americans found him, he was sitting on the wing of his wrecked aircraft, staring at the sky, silent. He didn't resist. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, the first thing he said was that they had been fighting the future, and the future won. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the proximity fuse remained a closely guarded secret. Even in victory, the Allies were paranoid. Soviet forces had overrun German territory and captured vast amounts of equipment, documents, and personnel. If the Russians got their hands on intact VT fuses, they might reverse engineer the technology. The Cold War was already beginning, though the guns in Europe had just fallen silent. American and British teams raced across occupied Germany, securing laboratories, interrogating scientists, and destroying or confiscating anything that might give the Soviets an edge. The proximity fuse was at the top of the list. Bomber bases were ordered to echo UNT for every VT round. Unexpended ammunition was shipped back to Allied depots under guard. The few fuses that had been dropped over land were tracked down and recovered, often from crash sites or unexploded ordnance. The secrecy held mostly. The Soviets knew something unusual had been used, but without physical samples, they couldn't replicate it quickly. Interrogations of captured Luftwaffe personnel yielded valuable insights into how the weapon had affected German morale and tactics. One recurring theme was helplessness. Pilots described feeling like they were fighting an enemy they couldn't touch, couldn't understand, couldn't defeat. It wasn't just the proximity fuse itself, but what it represented. The sense that the Americans had resources, technology, and industrial capacity so far beyond Germany's that resistance was futile. This psychological dimension, the erosion of hope, was as important as the physical destruction the weapon caused. Wars are won when the enemy stops believing they can win. The proximity fuse, more than almost any other weapon in the final year of the war, delivered that message with brutal clarity. You are outmatched. You are obsolete. You have already lost. For pilots who had once believed in German technological superiority and the righteousness of their cause, in the myth of the invincible Luftwaffe, the proximity fuse was proof that the myth was dead. The impact on post-war air combat doctrine was immediate and profound. Every major air force in the world began developing or acquiring proximity-fused munitions. The technology migrated from anti-aircraft artillery to air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and eventually guided munitions of all types. The principle remained the same. You don't need a direct hit, you just need to get close. Modern air defense systems, from Patriot missiles to ship-based Aegis systems, rely on variations of proximity fusing. The ghost of that 1945 innovation haunts every air battle fought since. It fundamentally changed what it meant to be a fighter pilot. In World War I and even in the early years of World War II, air combat was a duel. Pilot against pilot, skill against skill. By 1945, it was a technological slaughter. The better radar, the longer-range missile, the smarter fuse won. The human element, courage and skill, still mattered, but it mattered less. And that shift, that move toward automated lethality, set the template for the 70 years of warfare that followed. The legacy of the VT proximity fuse extended far beyond the skies over Germany. In the Pacific, it had already been used to devastating effect against Japanese kamikaze attacks. After the war, it became a cornerstone of naval air defense. Ships equipped with VT-fused anti-aircraft guns could shred incoming aircraft and missiles with terrifying efficiency. During the Korean War, proximity-fused artillery shells were used to devastating effect against massed infantry attacks, creating airburst explosions that killed soldiers in trenches and foxholes where conventional shells would have been ineffective. In Vietnam, proximity-fused munitions were used in both air-to-air and air-to-ground roles. The technology continued to evolve, becoming smaller, smarter, and more reliable. By the 1980s, proximity fuses were standard in almost every modern weapon system. They had gone from revolutionary to routine. But the human cost of that first deployment in the skies over Germany in early 1945 was staggering. Luftwaffe records, fragmentary and incomplete due to the chaos of the war's final months, suggest that thousands of German pilots were killed or wounded by proximity-fused defensive fire in the last 100 days of the war. Many of them were young men, barely out of training, sent into combat with inadequate preparation and obsolete tactics. They died not because they lacked courage, but because they were fighting an enemy whose technological advantage was insurmountable. Their deaths were not heroic. They were tragic. They were unnecessary. They were the inevitable result of a war that Germany had already lost, prolonged by a regime that refused to surrender. The proximity fuse didn't change the outcome of the war. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was certain, but it accelerated the end. It made the final months of the air war less costly for the Allies and far more deadly for the Germans. It saved the lives of bomber crews who would have died without it, and it killed fighter pilots who might have survived a few more weeks if it hadn't been deployed. The ethical questions raised by the weapon were quietly debated in the years after the war. Was it right to deploy such a devastating technological advantage when victory was already assured? Was it humane to continue slaughtering an enemy who no longer had the means to effectively resist? These questions were never satisfactorily answered, perhaps because they apply to all weapons, all wars, all moments when one side holds overwhelming power and chooses to use it. The proximity fuse was simply more efficient, more clinical, more invisible than most. It killed without drama, without the personal confrontation of a dogfight, without the spectacle of bombs falling or cities burning. It was a quiet, technical, bureaucratic kind of death, and in some ways, that made it more disturbing. It was a glimpse of the future of warfare, where battles would be fought by machines, guided by algorithms, decided by engineers in laboratories far from the front lines. The human beings involved, the pilots and gunners and soldiers, would become increasingly irrelevant, mere operators of systems they didn't fully understand, fighting enemies they never saw. The proximity fuse was one of the first steps down that road. There is a particular kind of terror that comes not from the enemy you face, but from the realization that you are facing something beyond your comprehension. The German fighter pilots who flew into the skies over their dying homeland in the first months of 1945 experienced that terror in its purest form. They were brave men, skilled men, many of them veterans who had survived years of brutal combat. But courage and skill meant nothing against a weapon that detonated on its own, guided by invisible waves of radio energy, designed by scientists they would never meet, manufactured in factories they would never see. They were killed by mathematics, by physics, by the cold logies. Sea of industrial production. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon, it was a message. It said that the age of the individual warrior, the ace, the hero, was over. What mattered now was who could build more, innovate faster, deploy smarter technology in greater numbers. The future belonged not to the brave, but to the efficient. And yet, in the end, wars are still fought by human beings. The proximity fuse saved lives on one side and took them on the other, but it did not make the war less human. Every explosion that tore through a German fighter killed a young man who had a name, a family, a life that ended in fire and shrapnel at 30,000 feet. Every bomber that made it home carried men who would live to see peace, to have children, to grow old. The weapon mattered because the people mattered. Technology shapes the battlefield, but it does not erase the moral weight of war. It only makes the killing more efficient. The German pilots who died in those final months were not defeated by American courage or Allied righteousness. They were defeated by the capacity of democratic nations to mobilize their economies, their industries, and their intellects toward total war. The proximity fuse was the embodiment of that capacity. It was America's industrial soul turned into a weapon and fired into the sky. And it worked. It worked so well that 70 years later we still use the same principle to guide missiles, defend ships, and control the skies. The invisible fire still burns,